To introduce our speaker this afternoon will be Dean Robert Buggart of the College of Fine and Applied Arts.
Thanks, Dr. Wells. This introduction is based upon two basic principles. One, that introductions should be short, and two, that certainly any introduction of Mr. Arthur Clarke would certainly be redundant in terms of the knowledge you people already have about Mr. Clarke and his work. To properly acknowledge his compliments of today's speaker, we could easily consume the total time allocated to his presentation. So I just mentioned a few, that the name of Arthur C. Clarke is associated with the following, to name a few of many: 2001, A Space Odyssey, space satellites, including The Origin of the Idea, the UNESCO Kalinga Prize for Scientific Writing, an Academy Award nomination, been associated as chairman with the British Interplanetary Society, member of the Academy of Astronauts, is associated with science in terms of fact, is associated with science in terms of fiction. On behalf of the College of Fine and Applied Arts, I am honored and pleased to present Life in the Year 2001 as forecast by Arthur C. Clarke. Mr. Clarke.
Thank you. I have the honor of belonging to the smallest and most obscure labor union in the United States, the Science Fiction Writers of America. For a long time we've been rather envious of our better-known colleagues, the mystery writers, because they had a very striking slogan. The mystery writers' motto is, "Crime does not pay enough." And we felt that we should have a similar phrase, and a remark of mine has been at least unofficially adopted as the motto of the science fiction writers, and I'd like to blow your minds with it. Our motto is, "The future isn't what it used to be." Now, in a way, this could be the subtitle of my talk, because our ideas of the future, our approach, our concept of the future, these things are continually changing. In fact, this is really the first age which ever gave a great deal of attention to the future, which is a little ironic since we may not have one. In the past, the future was, apart from the near future, what's going to happen tomorrow, next season's crops and so forth, the long-range future was of no particular interest or importance, because it was pretty obvious that it wouldn't change, wouldn't be fundamentally different from the past. But of course, that is altered with the coming of modern technology, and now we live in a world where the future is profoundly different, will be, we're pretty sure, profoundly different from the past, because we have seen how our present has also differed. Before it's too late, perhaps I better explain what it is I'm trying to do in this talk. I'm not attempting to predict with a capital T, future. That's impossible. What I am trying to do is to outline futures which may exist, possible futures, and I am restricting myself very largely to one aspect of the future, the technological future. This is perhaps the only area where you can do anything really useful, because coming inventions do cast their shadows ahead of them, and technological forecasting is now a very important subject. And even if you limit yourself to this area, it's extremely important, because technology does more and more determine the patterns of our lives and our deaths. However, even this restricted type of visualization, anticipation, is quite difficult and very tricky, because even if an invention already exists, staring you in the face, it may be quite impossible to anticipate its impact on society. Let me give a couple of examples which may amuse you, which do contain a very important lesson. About 100 years ago, a parliamentary commission was called in England to deal with the very alarming news from the United States that one Thomas Edison had invented an electric light, This was very alarming to the gas companies. And as we British do in an emergency, we called a parliamentary commission, which heard expert witnesses, who assured the gas companies that nothing further would be heard of this impractical Yankee invention. One of the witnesses called was the chief engineer of the post office. And somebody said to him, what about this latest American gadget, the telephone? Do you think the telephone will be of use in England? Whereupon the chief engineer of the post office replied, no, sir. The Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys. Now, this is what I call a failure of imagination. This very able man, a couple of decades later, he backed Marconi in his first wireless experiments. Maybe he learned a lesson by then. He totally failed to see in the telephone more than a substitute for messenger boys. He couldn't imagine the time would come when it would dominate our business, our social lives, when in fact our culture, our civilization couldn't exist without it. The second example is rather nearer. When the first horseless carriages started running around at the beginning of the century, it was pointed out that even if they could get the bugs out of them and they could travel as far as 100 miles without breaking down, they would be very limited in their use, in their application. The motor car, it was logically and realistically pointed out, could only be of use in the city for a perfectly fundamental reason. There were no roads outside the cities. At the beginning of the century, the United States had 150 miles of road. Who could have dreamed in a lifetime it would be all road? So you see how difficult it is to predict the outcome, the impact of an existing invention. What about the unexpected one? If I was giving this talk in 1800, I'm sure I'd say a great deal about the marvels of the steam engine. I might not even mention electricity. If I was giving this talk in 1900, certainly I'd say a lot about radio, or wireless as it was then, picture telegraphy, the possibilities of heavier-than-air flight, the motor car. I wouldn't mention atomic energy. I wonder what I'm overlooking now. I'll mention two things that I'm overlooking, but rather in the spirit of the Scottish preacher who said to his congregation, we now come to a very difficult passage, and having looked it squarely in the face, we pass on. The two things I just mentioned which make any attempt to outline the future impossible, are both inevitable, but nobody knows when. The first is contact with intelligent extraterrestrials. This may not happen for 1,000 years. It may happen tomorrow. Contrary to some believers, it hasn't happened yet. The other, which is probably much nearer in time, is the rise of the intelligent machine. This is probably going to happen in the earlier part of the next century. And of course, when this happens, when either of these things happen, all bets are off. In fact, a friend of mine once remarked that the first intelligent machine is the last invention man need ever make. Maybe the last invention he's ever permitted to make. Well, you may think I've proved it's impossible to say anything useful and sensible about the future with all these reservations. This may be true, but it's still worth trying, worth attempting. It's good fun, which is the only reason you need for doing anything. But it's also useful because it does help to develop flexibility of mind. We have seen in the past the chaos produced when some new development has come along and society hasn't been ready for it. By sketching out possible futures, we can decide which ones we like, and we can hopefully work towards them. I admit that we science fiction writers are rather fonder of sketching perfectly horrible futures which nobody would want, But even this is worthwhile because they can serve as dreadful warnings, which of course is what 1984, Brave New World, Space Merchants and others stories have tried to do. I chose as my title The World of 2001, or Life in the Year 2001. I chose that date for several reasons, one of which should be rather obvious, and others perhaps not so. You know, 2001, not 2000, is the first year of the new century, the new millennium, because our calendar starts with the year 1, not with the year 0. This means that you've got to wait till midnight on December 31st, 2000, before you start your celebrations as the clock strikes midnight. But I know the psychological effect of those 3 zeros going up is going to be too great, and all the fun is going to start a year too soon. So I've suggested the only solution is to declare the whole of the year 2000 a holiday. If we make it, we'll be fully justified. Now, 2001 or 2001 or whatever you like to call it is as far off as 1940, a date with which not many of you are personally acquainted. It's, almost back to Bonnie and Clyde, isn't it? But yet, it's even further away than that, because the rate of technology is still increasing. 2001 is really as far off as the 1890s. And this is a rather profound thought, because it was around about that period of time that the great revolution took place in our everyday way of life, in our homes, in our comfort and convenience. A revolution which cuts us off from the past completely and makes us live lives far more comfortable and hygienic than that of the greatest prince of medieval times, or the greatest emperor of the past. And the elements of that revolution were very few. Piped water, indoor plumbing, gas cooking and heating, electric light, the telephone. When you think, you take these completely for granted, when you think what they have done to our way of life, it's hard to see that any technological change in the future can really be quite so profound. In fact, I think the only equally important development in the whole 1,000 years that went before was the introduction of glass windows. Well, let's see what future technological changes we can envisage. Well, one thing which I'm sure is coming is the home automat. In another couple of decades, or even less, you'll be able to get your month's meals delivered in the house in a package weighing about 100 pounds for the average family. You may think that's not very much, but let me remind you that 90% of all food is water, 90% of you is water, nothing personal. Why should you buy that when you can add it from the tap as the astronauts do? So you see, you'll just dial the meal you want, it'll be reconstituted and emerge perfectly cooked in about 10 minutes. Or else the sign will flash up saying, sorry, filet mignon out of stock. And if it is in stock, it will never have been near a cow. Here I come to a subject of some area of some delicacy, which is probably going to get me lynched when I give this talk in an agricultural neighborhood, where's the way out here? But we've got to face the fact, I think, that natural meat production is so uneconomic that it may be quite impractical, if indeed it isn't prohibited by law in the next century. You see, it takes about 10 pounds of vegetable matter, 10 pounds of fodder, to make 1 pound of beef or meat. Looking at it in another way, for every man who eats meat, 10 men have got to starve. Cows and sheep and pigs and so forth are mobile processing factories with efficiencies of less than 10%. We can't continue to waste good agricultural land on them. Well, I happen to be a carnivore who hates vegetables and thinks that salads are rabbit food, so I look on this situation with considerable distress. Perhaps we can maintain natural meat production on marginal land that's no use for anything else. This will mean probably exploiting new animals. There's a lot of work going on in Africa with antelopes, tapirs, and for swamplands there's that rather large pig, the hippopotamus. And of course, there's the sea. We are everywhere on the sea what we were everywhere on land a few thousand years ago, what we were in this continent a few hundred years ago, primitive hunters. We have to develop as quickly as possible the equivalent of many types of land agriculture, aquaculture if you like, in the ocean. I'm not going to get into this very big area in any detail here, but a great deal has been published on it and is easily accessible. The sea has been oversold in some areas, but there is still a great potential. The food potential of the sea can at least be doubled, which is would be no small contribution to mankind, because there are still areas although some areas have been badly overfished, there are others which are still unexploited. I'll just mention in passing one thing that rather interests me, because I've written a novel about it, and that is whale ranching. Whales are large, intelligent mammals with a language of their own. They could be herded and controlled. And you know, a cow that produces half a ton of milk a day is an interesting economic proposition, particularly as that milk is 10 times as rich in fat as cow's milk. But we have another problem here, a moral problem. Now, we're justified in killing animals which have brains as complex as ours and larger. Whales are giant dolphins. Think of the outcry if anybody set up a flipper farm. However, I must admit that I'm getting a little skeptical of the intelligence of dolphins for a rather fundamental reason. They do seem much too friendly to man. At least most of them are, but I was chased out of the water by a dolphin off Hawaii the other day, which others changed my approach to them. Anyway, whatever happens on land or sea, in the conventional and even slightly non-conventional areas, I think that inevitably, sometime in the next century, most food production will be from non-living materials or inorganic materials, on oil, limestone, coal, water, and so forth. There's a tremendous research effort going into this, and it's already beginning to pay off. Again, I'll mention only one area of interest. This is microbiological engineering. The development of strains of bacteria, microbes, funguses, to process inedible materials and to turn them into food. This sounds rather nauseating, but let me remind you that microbiological engineering is the way we have always made our most exquisite and expensive luxury foods. This is how you make cheeses, wines, spirits. But the technique has now been applied to unpromising materials like oil. And the first pilot plants, more than that, their factories have been set up in France and England to produce several thousand tons of protein a year from petroleum. And the people working on these projects believe that they can produce eventually good quality beef. I'm not referring to these pills you see in the science fiction films and stories, but steaks that will look like and taste like the real thing for a cost, and you better hold on your hats, of about 15 cents a pound. Perhaps more important, about 3% of the world's petroleum production could feed the entire human race. Texas and Oklahoma could feed the world, and may have to. It's about time we stopped burning petroleum and started eating it. These and similar developments will, I think, result in the phasing out of agriculture in the next century, with the resultant liberation of vast areas of land. What's all this new land going to be used for? Well, I hope it isn't used. I hope it's allowed to revert to wilderness. Thoreau once remarked, "In wildness is the preservation of the world," and we're beginning to realize this. We need wilderness psychologically and physiologically. Here's a statistic which is rather an impressive one. Do you know it takes 25 square feet of grass to regenerate the oxygen of one man? What are we doing to the life support system of our planet with our roads and our airfields and our parking lots and cities? One of the other developments which is going to lead to the end of our present agricultural system is going to be a byproduct of space research. For long duration journeys for bases on the moon and planets, we've got to develop a closed cycle economy in which all wastes are reprocessed and turned back into food. This, of course, is just what the primitive agricultural village does. We have an endless cycle from the field to the kitchen to the compost heap to the field to the kitchen, a cycle powered in the past by the energy of sunlight. But it'll be done in a much more compact and sophisticated form in the future, and you won't have to have acres and acres of area to just collect the very dilute energy of sunlight, because we'll have compact energy sources to run the system. And this may lead to the totally enclosed, self-contained, small community or even individual house generating its own food indefinitely. I'm indebted for many of these ideas to your neighbor Bucky Fuller, and he's put forward the concept of the autonomous home, which would have no roots tying it to the ground. You need have no water pipes, no drains. One day, hopefully, no power lines, because surely eventually we're going to find a way of storing and generating electricity in a compact form. So we could have completely mobile homes. On this line, Bucky Fuller has put forward an even more delightful idea. You know his beautiful geodesic domes like the one at Expo? These can be made in any size. He wants to put one over New York City to keep the weather out or the New Yorkers in. And when these are more than about 1,000 feet in diameter, something very interesting happens. The structure is so light and efficient that the air inside it becomes very much heavier. The weight of the air inside becomes much greater than that of the structure itself. This means that if there's a temperature rise of a few degrees, it can become a hot air balloon and take off. So you see, you could have migrant cities moving south in winter or north in summer, or whenever the occupants felt they'd like a change of scenery. And you know, there's still enormous uninhabited areas, even now on this planet, that would be very attractive to live in if one could live there. Every year, I commute to the United States 2 or 3 times from my home in Ceylon, which means that I fly for hours, even in a jet plane, over the Middle East, and you pass over regions rather like the Grand Canyon, but much wider, not so spectacular or deep, but very, very interesting scenery. Mount Ararat, places like that. And there's nobody there because there's no way you can grow crops and no way you can live there. But this sort of place might become at least the temporary real estate of the 21st century. I hope it isn't wrecked in the process. Now, a mobile, planet-wide culture demands cheap, instantaneous communications. And I want to spend some time talking about the communications revolution, which is now about to burst upon us and which will determine the shape of the century to come. That revolution has been sparked by 2 developments. One is the rise of solid-state physics, the transistor and its successors, which enable us, or will enable us, to do almost anything we like with compact, cheap, reliable equipment. And the other is the communication satellite, which, by removing the limitations of range suffered by all the shortwaves and microwaves, which in the past have been limited by the curvature of the Earth to a range of only 50 miles, by moving the transmitter out in space, we can get worldwide range from a transmitter in orbit. The first commercial communications satellite, Early Bird, carried 240 simultaneous telephone channels, telephone circuits. That was launched only 6 years ago. Intelsat 4, which is up now, carries not 240, but 6,000 simultaneous circuits. By the end of the century, we could have enough capability in orbit for the whole human race to pair off and talk to itself. And we'll need that capacity to do the sort of things I now want to tell you about. In another decade or so, they'll be coming into the home, a kind of communications console with a television screen, camera, microphone, computer keyboard, and probably hard copy readout if you want a permanent record of what's on the screen. Through this, anyone, anywhere, will be able to be in contact, visually, face-to-face, with anyone, anywhere else, and be able to exchange any type of information. Let's see what this is going to do. Well, this means the end of the newspaper as we know it now. You see, you'll just dial your local service, and you'll see all the headlines, and you'll go through looking at what you want: news, editorials, sports, book reviews, theater. It'll all be there, and you just blow up whatever section you're interested in. It'll appear on the screen, you'll read it, you go on to the next item, thus saving entire forests for posterity. I think the New York Times, I think I have an Isaac Asimov fan here in the front row. I've dedicated my new book to Ike. He doesn't know it yet, though. He can hear the recording later. But you see, more than the local newspaper, every newspaper on earth will be equally accessible at your fingertips. More than that, every newspaper that's ever been, right back to the first issue of The Spectator, in 17, whenever it was, will be there, because ultimately this device will be tuned into the global electronic library, and everything ever printed or recorded will be available to you if you dial the correct 40-digit number. I'm not going to get involved in the problem of information retrieval, but the time is going to come. The time is going to come when scholars, students, school children, everybody will find it impossible to imagine how we could ever have operated without this absolutely basic information device. Just as today, we cannot imagine the world before there were books. This device will absorb the telephone system. There'll be no such thing as a long-distance phone call in the world of the future. There are no long distances to satellites. You'll probably be charged a flat rate for phone calls, irrespective of distance. If indeed you're charged at all, I suspect you'll just rent your console by the month of the year. Once you've got it installed, you can use it as much as you like. This situation already exists with respect to some computer terminals. I would like to know what percentage of the cost of a phone call today goes to pay for the incredibly complex equipment that does nothing but calculate the cost of the call. If the farmers don't get me, the Bell system will. But the biggest revolution is one which has not yet begun, but which hopefully is going to start in 2 years' time. The communication satellites in orbit now are feeble, low-powered affairs whose signals can only be picked up by multi-million-dollar ground stations with antennas as big as football fields, which feed their signals, their television signals, into your local TV network, or their telephone calls into the local telephone system. But it is now possible to launch satellites sufficiently powerful for their signals to be picked up by an ordinary domestic television receiver, plus a chicken wire antenna about 6 or 10 feet in diameter, and a converter costing between $100 and $200. This is direct broadcast from satellite into home, or at any rate from satellite into small community or individual school. It's impossible to overestimate the importance of this development, not in this country, which has plenty of communications, but in countries which have no communications at all. I have been working for some time on a TV special called The Promise of Space, and I've just been filming the beginning of this communications revolution in the country where it's going to start, the country which needs it most desperately, India. The Indian government has problems you can scarcely begin to imagine. You think you have problems, and that's true enough, but they are totally trivial compared with those of the Indians, who have more than 500,000 villages containing nearly 500 million people scattered over a whole continent. In some areas, only 1 person in 10 can read. I think the overall literacy is about 3 in 10. Even if you get newspapers to all these villages, they wouldn't be much use. In fact, it's impossible physically to get from spot to spot during the monsoon rains. The only means of communication to all these places is radio or television. In 2 years' time, the United States is going to launch a satellite, ATSF, which is going to be parked over India. The Indian government is going to provide television receivers and the programs through this satellite. The first purpose of this satellite is family planning. The Indian government believes that the only way they may be able to solve their social problems, of which family planning is the first, and the second is improved agricultural and veterinary techniques, will be through educational programs broadcast from this satellite. In the course of my filming, I came to realize very acutely what an impact this could have. We visited a dairy complex near Bombay, or near Ahmedabad. A dairy cooperative, rather a large one. There were 250,000 farmers in it. Scale of things in India. And we filmed a poor old lady whose only calf was dying because she thought it had been bewitched and hadn't called the vet in time. They need education so badly in this area to save the lives of the cattle, let alone, I'm not even talking about the health of the human beings, that this dairy is going to build its own television transmitter just to feed veterinary information to the farmers in the 50-mile radius that they can serve. And of course this ATSF will cover not just a 50-mile area, but the whole of India, 500 million people. You only have to save a couple of cows in one village per year, and you pay for the whole thing. Sometimes I'm asked, well, what can a few television receivers do? Well, first of all, you only need 1 receiver per village. Around Delhi, they have television, conventional television, from a transmitter in the city. And in the evening, the entire village gathers around the screen. 400 or 500 people watch this one set. The introduction of the improved rice strains, improved the IR8 and so forth, was largely stimulated by radio. In fact, the villagers call the miracle rice radio paddy because they heard all about it over the radio. But television can be an even more effective means of getting information. And the educational impact and the cheapness of educational TV means that we could have a real revolution here, not only in India, but in other countries who need it just as badly, particularly South America, Brazil, Mexico, Africa. But South America is particularly interesting because they only have 2 languages to cope with, whereas in India you have at least 14. In Africa you have many more. But for a country the size of Brazil, I've seen some cost-effectiveness studies, and you can provide 12 channels of color TV to every school in Mexico or Brazil at a cost of about $1 per pupil per year. Nothing else is remotely comparable in cheapness. Incidentally, the University of Wisconsin has a big educational satellite project going, and there's a lot of works in this area. So I think you will understand why I get so angry with those well-meaning but ignorant people who say, why spend money on space when there are social problems to be solved here on Earth? There are some social problems that can only be solved in space, and the sooner this is realized in this country, the better. And failure to realize it may doom millions of people to starvation and misery. I'm not going to get involved in space in this talk because I want to cover a rather wider range of subjects. But I'd just like to give you one other statistic which may help you to squash some of the nonsense you hear talked about space these days. Did you know that a couple of years ago, a handful of satellites saved the United States the casualties of the Vietnam War in a single night? I'm referring to Hurricane Camille. Extrapolating from the effect of identical hurricane patterns at the beginning of the century, Camille would have taken 50,000 lives. That was totally prevented by the meteorological satellites. So I say, if you hear people asking, why spend money on space, tell them to find what the facts are before they talk nonsense. However, the biggest impact of direct broadcast communication satellites is an even wider area, in the areas of politics and sociology. Let me give you one example. If any one nation was to establish a monopoly of direct broadcast satellites, the language of that nation would become the language of all mankind. Bucky Fuller, I'm always quoting, once said that this is the first generation to be reared by three parents. All future generations are going to be reared by three parents. And I think we're going to see the rise of a global language as a result of this in the next century. And of course we only have a very simple choice between English, Russian, and Mandarin. I'd like to remind American audiences that this country was created 100 years ago by two inventions. Before they existed, you couldn't have a United States. Afterwards, it was inevitable. Those inventions were, of course, the locomotive and the electric telegraph. Although recently someone said to me, oh no, those weren't the two important inventions. The inventions that really created the United States were the Colt 45 and barbed wire, which I believe comes from this, which I believe comes from around here. But still, I think the locomotive and the electric telegraph are what really did the trick. And what we are seeing now is a repetition on a global scale of the same situation with the jet plane and the communication satellite playing a similar role. And I think the final outcome will be identical. I only hope the transition period is not equally turbulent. Of course, the global communication system is going to have great problems as well as solve them. One problem I'll mention to you so you can start thinking about it is a time zone problem. We'll be living in one world. We'll be able to speak to anybody anytime, and it'll be like living in a village where at any one moment a third of the people are asleep, but you will never know which third. What are you going to do about time zones? Well, two possibilities. We may have to pass a law prohibiting sleep. It's never been proved to be essential. It may be a bad habit contracted out in the remote past. Some animals don't sleep. Perhaps by electrical or chemical means we can get rid of it. That there may be a price to pay. Perhaps our dreams are essential, as some psychiatrists seem to think. So then the alternative is to abolish time zones. This involves a rather interesting problem. We have to do it this way. First of all, of course, we have to synchronize our watches. Everywhere on Earth, it is now 14 hours, 45 minutes, all over the planet. We all get up, say, at 07, 06 hours, and work about the same time, go to bed at 2200 hours or whatever. The whole world is synchronized. But if we did it this way, some people would have a raw deal. Those who got up where the sun was setting, wherever they happened to be, and had to work through the night. So we have to make one other change. Besides synchronizing our watches, we have to switch to sidereal time. The sidereal day is 4 minutes shorter than the solar day. Don't worry about the details, just get the general idea. This means that during the course of the year, the sun goes right round the clock. So you see, if you get up now at 06 hours, and the sun is just rising, when you get up at 06 hours in 6 months' time, the sun is just setting. So everybody has equal time in the sun. I still have not mentioned the most important consequence of the communications revolution. You'll see that when we have this device in our homes, almost everything that the average executive or businessman does can be done, if he wishes, without leaving home. This is how we're going to solve the traffic problem. Not by covering the world with concrete, but by getting rid of the traffic. Because the motto of the future is going to be, don't commute, communicate. Anyone with any technical or physical or mental skill could live wherever he wishes and be essentially at any spot on earth. I can see the time when if the world's leading heart surgeon, or, well, let's be ambitious, the world's leading brain transplant surgeon decides to live in Bali or Tahiti or Hawaii, he can do so and operate on patients anywhere on earth without leaving home through these electronically controlled remote manipulators they use in atomic energy establishments, some of which are so delicate now they can operate on single living cells and could cut the appendix out of a bacterium if it had one. Another impact of this communications revolution is that the city will begin to die. We don't need cities anymore. They were necessarily once so that men could meet, exchange ideas, consult, interact. That need is passing. When men everywhere can meet at a touch of a button, far more cheaply and conveniently than you can get a cab in a Manhattan rainstorm, they're going to choose the easier way of life. Well, we'll have small cities or large towns indefinitely for industrial processes. There'll be university towns and so forth. But the vast conurbations that have blighted so much of this planet for the last couple of centuries will slowly fade away. Very slowly, because bricks and mortar and steel have got such enormous inertia and represent such tremendous capital investment. I've little doubt there'll be even larger cities in the year 2001 than there are today, but they'll be like the dinosaurs in the last age of their giantism. A century later, there will be only bones. Unless, well, there's always the possibility that the population explosion cannot be controlled. In that case, the whole world will become one seething city. But that wouldn't last for long. Even if medical science kept that old regulator, the Black Death, at bay, nature would redress the balance, because there are plagues of the mind worse than those of the body, and the meaningless violence that's racked many communities could be a mild foretaste of a psychologically overcrowded future. Although everyone who studied the matter now accepts the need for population control, usually for other populations, very little thought has been given to the level we should aim at. Now, I don't want to get into this area because this evening you have a chance of hearing a much greater expert than me on the subject, but I will make a few points now about the optimum population of the world, which is, you see, with proper organization, we could certainly support a much larger population than today, and at a reasonable standard of living. But should we do so? In a world of instantaneous communications, what is the point of a population of more than a few million? When we reach the steady state, as we've got to eventually, that steady state can be any value we like. It might take us centuries to get to that, but it could be at any arbitrary level we wished. What should that level be? The astronomer Fred Hoyle once remarked to me that the optimum population of the world should be about 100,000 people, because that's the maximum number you can get to know in a lifetime. Well, this is a rather self-centered or even solipsistic viewpoint, but it's an interesting one. And it's worth remembering that Plato thought the ideal city should contain only about 5,000 free men. Of course, Plato's city also contained a much larger number of slaves. His so-called democracy couldn't have functioned without them. Nor can the world of the future, especially if its population is ultimately stabilized at a small fraction of today's figure. The big difference is that the slaves of the future won't be human. Many of them, of course, will be robots at all levels of sophistication, from things like today's primitive washing machines up to the ultra-intelligent home computer that babysits the children, teaches them, answers the phone calls, does your income tax returns, sort of secretary valet, like my friend Hal. We'll have a central brain and sensors all around the house and mobile robots under his control for cleaning up and so forth. But for this particular application, there's a non-mechanical solution which has considerable advantages. Why should we go to the trouble of building very complex electronic robots when nature's done 99% of the job for us? The next great breakthrough in technology is going to be in biological engineering. Of course, we've used animals for ages as extensions of our personalities and our bodies. The sheepdog, the seeing eye dog, the working elephant. These are remarkable examples of what can be done with existing animals. If we tried, in a few decades we could develop a creature based on the chimpanzee, but with a tenfold improvement in intelligence, motivation, vocabulary, and particularly disposition. A domesticated ape. When it comes in the labor market, the servant shortage will be over, and the housewife of 2001 need no longer be envious of her great-great-grandmother of 1901, until, of course, they start to form their own unions. You may well object at this point, if you haven't already, that the main result of these developments will be to eliminate 99% of human activity and to leave your descendants faced with a future of utter boredom, where the main problem in life is deciding which of the several thousand TV channels to tune to. This is perfectly true if we look at humanity as it is constituted today. H.G. Wells once said that future history would be a race between education and catastrophe. I don't know if even that great prophet realized the educational standards we've got to aim at to cope with the coming age of universal leisure. Just as there's no function today for manual laborers, and there'll be none tomorrow for those of only clerical and executive skills, so the day after tomorrow, society will have no place for anyone as ignorant as the average mid-20th century college graduate. If anyone here I've not offended, I apologize. He will be as lost and helpless as one of those very educated men, the Pilgrim Fathers, dumped in Times Square during the rush hour. Now, if it seems an impossible goal to bring the whole population of this planet, even if it's down to a couple of millions, up to super university levels, remember that a few centuries ago it would have seemed unthinkable that everyone should be able to read and write. You know, in the Middle Ages, if a boy in England wanted to learn arithmetic, Oxford and Cambridge could cope if he was content to go no higher than addition and subtraction. If he wanted to learn multiplication and division, he had to go to Europe. Standards have improved a little. They can improve a lot more with the new techniques on the horizon. The development of teaching machines, for example. Have you heard the remark that any teacher who can be replaced by a machine should be? Investigations of the way in which the brain stores information. Conceivably even experiments with the so-called consciousness-expanding drugs, although it's my personal opinion that there's only one consciousness-expanding drug, and that is science fiction. These hint at the new weapons we've got to use in the war against ignorance. The greatest single industry of the future is going to be education. It has to be a process which continues throughout life. We've got to abandon as swiftly as possible the idea that schooling is something restricted to youth. How can it be in a world where half the things a man knows at 20 are no longer true at 40, and half the things he knows at 40 hadn't been discovered when he was 20? The great problem of the next century is going to be raising the school leaving age to approximately 120. So perhaps the greatest change at the turn of the millennium will have to be in the mental attitude required then, rather than the physical background to life. We have to develop a flexibility of mind, a capacity for organizing knowledge, and an active curiosity about the universe, which will make us seem almost a new species. Anyone who's ever had the stimulating and rather shattering experience of meeting a really educated man will know precisely what I mean. I've been very lucky. I've met an educated man twice in my life. In the race against catastrophe, of which H.G. Wells warned us so long ago, the last lap has already begun. If we lose it, the world of 2001 will be much like ours, with its problems and evils and vices enlarged, perhaps beyond endurance. But if we win, 2001 could mark the great divide between barbarism and civilization. It is inspiring to realize that, with some luck and much hard work, we have a chance of living to see the final end of the Dark Ages. Thank you.
While we were driving out from the airport in the car, Mr. Jan Bach, who was up here with us, and myself, we got to talking about great inventions, so naturally barbed wire did come up, and Mr. Bach said that he knew of a still greater invention that was probably the greatest invention that has come about since the beginning of time, and he said that that was the Venetian blind, and without that it would be curtains for all of us. Mr. Clarke has said that he would like to divide the remaining time into two parts. First, he would be happy to address any questions which any of you have from the floor, and following that he'd be happy to come down front and chat with those of you who wish to remain for a short time. However, because of his schedule, we will need to have him out at the information desk by 3:45. So with that, we may start the questions. Mr. Clarke has said he will field his own questions. I'll point to the first gentleman.
Okay. Right, thank you. Pardon?
I still hear people asking, wondering what the last scene of the movie 2001 Space Odyssey.
Oh dear. In self-defense, because I've been asked the meaning of 2001 some 2001 times, I can only give one answer, which is this: you must see the movie and read the book, and then repeat the dose as often as necessary. However, I must add to that I do have a book myself coming out later this year called The Lost Worlds of 2001, which hopefully will add to the confusion.
With much respect, sir, for your knowledge, I get questions about the question you posed about dealing with the problem that technocracy has created by using technology to alleviate the same problem. I really question if you can solve the problem that's created in the same way.
The problems of technology, well, it's a matter of definition. Everything we have is technology. From the clothes we wear, the first bone we picked up at the beginning of 2001, that is the beginning of technology. So there's no argument that all our problems can only be solved by technology, just as all our problems are only created by technology. So much of this argument is a verbal one. Where should we stop? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? Obviously, there have been some technological debacles and stupidities in the past, and the public is at last becoming aware of them. It's over, in some ways it is overreacting. And this is also dangerous, because this means that things that should be done may not be done, and then will have to be done in a great hurry later on. Some things which should be done, and which everybody agrees ought to be done, can't be done for economic reasons. But let me have an example. I mentioned I live in Ceylon. Probably a third and a quarter of the people there owe their lives to DDT. Ceylon is a classic textbook case, which Paul Ehrlich may be quoting, in fact, which you find in all the textbooks of the use of DDT. It was the first case where it was used to wipe out malaria, which previously kept the population steady. And now, as soon as they had the first DDT campaign, the population started going up at 2.5% a year, whatever it is. Ceylon cannot afford to stop using DDT. In fact, it did just this about 2 years ago, and as a result, malaria came back with a bang, and they had to start all over again. They slipped back, and they've got to bring in more DDT. They can't afford to use the more expensive things. Now, this is very seldom a clear-cut case. But the only answer to our problems is more technology. This is absolutely fundamental. About this, there is no conceivable argument. Those who don't believe this will solve the problem themselves because they will die. But I agree with you that I'm sure you mean that much technology is bad and has been misapplied, but this is not usually a technological problem. It is almost always a political problem, or a financial problem, or a problem of greed and stupidity. And so really it comes back, as everything does in the long run, to education.
Well, my question is very related to that. You mentioned, for example, the tremendous benefits in terms of communication with communication satellites. An executive wouldn't have to leave his home or anything like that. And aside from what that might do to the intimacy of human contact with one another, the problem is that up to now, increased facilities for communication and storage and retrieval of information have been used largely by the FBI to accumulate files on us all. And aren't you merely saying that it's going to be possible for some even larger organizations to collect even more files? Of course, but this is one of the problems. But we can't ban books because people print dirty books. I mean, any form of technology has its abuses, uses, and abuses. So in this case, the solution is not to ban computers, but to have legislation which, for example, says that anyone must have access to their own files. All these things can be done. They're quite simple political and social solutions to them. Well,
okay, yes, here's a quick follow-on, but I ought to give everyone a chance.
The thing is that the large-scale technological inventions create substantial institutions behind them, like, as you mentioned, the phone company. These institutions have substantial amount of power because they do control these very expensive technological machines. Even with certain legislation, the individual himself is pretty much left at the mercy because he has incomparable power.
Yes, I mean, this is the whole problem of power in the modern society. But of course, remember, in the long run, the people who control the phone company, the people who pay the bills. You're the man who controls the phone company. Nothing to stop you getting a job with Mother Bell, is there? This is what is happening more and more with people like Ralph Nader and his colleagues. The answers are fairly simple, it seems to me. It may be a little more difficult to join the FBI, but it's curious how this question on the SSD has cropped up everywhere. I expected it to come up when I was lecturing in Seattle the other day, and it did. But in fact, it seems it's a widespread one. I'd never made up my mind about the SSD. It's one of those very evenly balanced things. However, I must admit that I am biased because I would like to see the Concorde have a good run for its money. In any case, the SSD is far less important than the space shuttle, the reusable space vehicle, to get payloads into orbit and astronauts into orbit and application satellites into orbit cheaply, and the sort of the DC-3 of space. We can manage without the SSD. We have plenty of quite good airplanes around right now, and it seems pretty obvious that even if we had an SSD, the airlines would be unable to pay for it. I read somewhere the other day that a jumbo jet flew across the United States the other day with one passenger, and they lost his baggage. Down in that enormous hole, I suppose.
Where do you think the line would be drawn in
Where should the lines be drawn in genetic manipulation? I don't know. This is an area outside my field of competence. I suggest you ask Paul Ehrlich. Will we ever beat the speed of light? Yes, I've said this occasionally, that it is a limit, but it's very interesting. In the last few years, there's been a lot of speculation to the effect that the speed of light is not a limit, not a fundamental limit. There are several reasons for thinking this. First of it is that we've just realized that the theory of relativity does not prohibit speeds greater than light. All that the relativity equations do is say you cannot travel at the speed of light. Everything becomes infinite or zero. But beyond the speed of light, when b is greater than c, the equations might have meaning again if you make certain assumptions, as some physicists have done, and they've tried to construct, and they have in fact apparently constructed a self-consistent physics of particles which can never travel slower than light. Now, whether that will ever be of any use to us, whether such particles exist, these so-called tachyons, and they've started looking for them, these are interesting speculations. The other possibility is the good old space warp, a sort of hole in space which you disappear in a hole here and you come out somewhere else. This has been around for quite a long time, and that has recently come into respectability, largely as a result of the work of Professor John Wheeler. And now the discovery of neutron stars and the so-called black holes has focused more interest on this, because those black holes might be the entrances to these wormholes in space, because matter disappears into them and might conceivably come out somewhere else. But whether the transit time from A to B in our universe would work out as greater than the speed of light or not, we don't know. And this is all theoretical speculation, of course, but it's quite stimulating. In any case, let me point out the speed of light is not going to limit exploration of the universe. There are many ways we can explore at least the local star system, despite this limitation. It's just going to take a rather long time. Well, with a central educational system, will there be such a thing as morality? I'm not quite sure I understand the logic of this, because it seems to me that the two aren't incompatible. I didn't know that education drove out morality. I know that there's some hard hats think so, but I don't think necessarily we have a central education authority. We may have lots of different things, different networks. One of the possibilities of this information explosion is the enormous variety of communications, of information available. And Alvin Toffler has pointed this out very well in his book Future Shock, which I strongly recommend. Incidentally, if you can get hold of it, there's a very, I think, very interesting one-hour discussion between Alvin Toffler, Margaret Mead, and myself, which is available on a gramophone record from MGM, discussion of the world of 2001 and some of the social and it was done on Columbia Radio, and I know there's a recording of it, and we discuss a lot of these points. But now, as far as morality is concerned, I mean, obviously, there always has got to be some kind of morality in any society. I mean, it's the way you behave. But what that morality will be, I mean, it's changing all the time, of course. That's another question. I don't really know the answers to that. Who were the two educated men I met? One was the great geneticist and biologist J.B.S. Haldane, probably the most brilliant man I ever met. And the other was the science fiction writer and philosopher Olaf Stapledon, who wrote Last and First Men, Star Maker, and the great classics of science fiction. They're both dead, so as far as I know, there are no educated men alive now.
In the interim of time between now and when cities decentralize, we'll need more efficient modes of mass transportation. Do you predict any types of energy like hydrodynamics which could be used to offset and prevent pollution?
What city transportation system? Well, we can do anything we would like in the way of transportation. Obviously, we've got to have much more public transportation. so people can get around cheaply and efficiently and quietly and without pollution. It's impossible for me to live in an American city because I cannot drive a car. And so there are many people like me. There are some cities which are, of course, like Los Angeles, which are intolerable because of this reason. So city transport has to be developed. There are many ways of doing that. Which are the best, I don't know. These are technological and economic problems. I think a lot of ink has been wasted on discussing far-out technological solutions when perhaps the solutions are quite simple technically and are very difficult politically and economically. Most public transport systems seem to be in great trouble, but that's perhaps because they're obsolete already. We should try to patch up old ones, but try to create new ones.
You mentioned that you didn't believe that there had been contact between extraterrestrial creatures and ourselves. What is your opinion of UFOs?
Very little. However, I'm very interested in them, and I've written a fair amount on them. There's an essay in one of my books called Things in the Sky, which I describe some of those that I've seen, and then leave it as an exercise to the reader to deduce what they were. Since then I've seen many more, and some of them were beauties, and one at least, which was seen, curious enough, by Stanley Kubrick and I, the night we decided to make 2001. No one will believe this. And we actually put in a sighting report to the Pentagon. It took us a long time to find out what it was. But every case, they all collapsed eventually, and often ludicrously simple explanations. And having been through this process now 8 or 10 times, I'm totally skeptical of anything anybody sees. I'm convinced that if there are visitors from space, we'll know it in 10 minutes flat. And they won't.
What do you think is the possibility of colonizing the moon?
Lunar colonization is certainly possible. I am fairly confident it will be done, at least on a small scale, in the way that we've colonized, if you like, the Antarctic. Now, to what extent, whether there'll ever be more than a few hundred people on the moon, a few thousand, or a few million, no one at this point in time can say. But certainly, we could colonize any planet in this solar system, because the problems of colonization are just power and intelligence and organization. We could colonize any of the planets if we wished, ultimately. We might have to do something pretty drastic to planets like Jupiter and Saturn, such as squashing them to about half their present diameter, getting rid of all the excess hydrogen and a few things like that. But even these things could be done, because remember that we have, unless we blow ourselves up, billions of years ahead of us. And the time will come in the fairly near future, extrapolating our present power curves, when we'll have at our disposal the energy sources of the sun, at least.
I've heard the only thing about 4.5 billion is longer.
You're like, yes, I reminded the story of the old lady who went up to the astronomer and said, "Did you say the sun would last for 4 million or 4 billion years?" And when he said 4 billion, she said, "Thank God, I thought you had said 4 million." But I think that's probably answers your question. Actually, there's no reason to suppose the sun, won't continue to shine for not millions, but billions, not billions, but even trillions of years. It won't be anything like its present form. I forget the actual latest theory of the sun's future evolution, but it becomes hotter and hotter eventually, and then blows up and then cools off again to a red dwarf. But when it reached the red dwarf state, then it could shine steadily for, I say, not just billions, but trillions of years. And so we just have to move out when the Big Bang comes and move in close to a few, and then we can carry on for practically infinity. Well, our chances of blowing ourselves up are excellent, but they're a little less, I think, than they were a few years ago. I would say we now have a 51-49 chance of survival, whereas probably the odds were switched only a few years ago.
You once said that Jupiter is the biological center of the solar system, and you put in our goal year or some further evidence?
Yes, the feeling is more and more strong now that Jupiter is the interesting planet. In fact, Isaac Asimov once said that the solar system consists of Jupiter plus debris. And It's ideal for life, early forms of life. The temperature is right. The chemicals are just those that existed on Earth when life originated here. The pre-oxygen life. So we may find some very interesting processes going on there. I have just written a long story on the exploration of Jupiter, longest story I've written for, I think, nearly 20 years, called A Meeting with Medusa, which I'm happy to say you'll be seeing appearing as a serial in Playboy magazine sometime. How much influence did Nietzsche have on 2001? As far as I'm concerned, no conscious influence whatsoever. I'd never read Nietzsche, and curious enough, although I had quoted him in one of my essays about man being a bridge across, a man being linked between the human and the superhuman, a bridge across the abyss. I quoted this a number of years ago in one of my essays, but I was not conscious of any influence when we were working on the film. And I never heard the Zarathustra music until one day Stanley went into the projection theater, and Stanley said, "Listen to this." And it's the first time I ever heard it. And this was quite late in the day after being through all sorts of other musical themes. And whether in fact Kubrick chose that music, the Zarathustra theme, just because of its musical content, whether he was influenced by its philosophical content, or whether the philosophical content anyway influenced Strauss's thinking about the musical content, is a sort of can of worms that I'm sure a lot of PhD theses are being worked out on. Well, I've subscribed to both. I mean, you might say that Hal was a Frankenstein-type robot, but as far as I discuss this in more detail in my new book, where I actually bring in Isaac's 3 laws of robotics. Isaac was rather indignant with me. He's saying, when he saw 2001 first, he sort of said, but he's disobeying the first law. Well, I point out, for those of you who don't know Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics, the first one says that no robot shall injure a human being. Well, these are very useful, this is very desirable, noble aspirations, but as I'm fond of pointing out, most of the robots that have been built so far have been built for the express purpose of killing human beings. So much for the universal validity of the law. When will we start building the first starship? We won't have the technology to do this for, I say, at least 100 years. But sometime in the next century, we may be able to build propulsion systems which could get us to the nearest star system in a few centuries. And then it would be worth considering at least building robot probes to go out and have a look and radio back information. That's all I can really say. Now, of course, if anybody suddenly invents a space warp, that might change the situation overnight. Yes, technology does, strictly speaking, also embrace social inventions. I mean, I suppose the Constitution of the United States was a tremendous technological invention. The limited liability company, it was another great technological invention. And obviously we need them both, and that has been our problem, of course, that the social side of technology has lagged the hardware side. The software, this is happening in computers too. The hardware is often much easier to make than the software. And one of the hopes now is that people are realizing this and are getting a much clearer view of where the problem lies. Well, the spirit of man, of course, is such a vast, amorphous subject, and as I said, as I was careful to say it, I was deliberately restricting myself to an area where one could make various concrete statements. And the trouble is, in this area, one ends up usually waffling pious platitudes. I'll try to avoid that. It seems to be one of the most characteristic aspects of man is his curiosity, his inventiveness, his urge to discover, explore, and change his environment. This really is the spirit of man. And to say that we should stop doing this would be a violation to our essential spirit. And when if the time has come to do this, then it probably indicates that the time is right for our successors, who may be the intelligent machines, as I've pointed out elsewhere.
Do you think it'll ever be possible that one of these books, The City in the Stars, will ever become the basis for a movie?
Well, I'd like to think that all my books will one day become the basis for a movie. Childhood's End is going to be filmed someday. They've been working on that for years. But don't hold your breath. It was sold 11 years ago. The City in the Stars is a possibility. It's going to be quite a tricky one. The one I actually would like to see filmed is The Deep Range, my whale ranching book. We'll have to hurry while the whales are still around. A few more questions before we... Well, we've just got to get, everyone knows, we have to exploit nuclear energy. And in particular, we've got to get fusion energy, thermonuclear power. We think we're getting near a breakthrough in this. And, of course, the advantage of thermonuclear power is that we then essentially have an infinite energy source, the oceans of the world. The big problem is not availability of power, but thermal pollution as our power utilization increases. If you continue these curves, assuming that we do have fusion power, and we probably will have it around the end of the century, in a very short time, if you do extrapolate this power consumption curve, you find the Earth becomes red hot, which is inconvenient. So we're probably going to have to move right out into, that's another reason why we're going to have to move out into space. All the heavy industry and heavy engineering and massive use of power will have to be out in space. And we're probably going to tap solar power and probably tap it in much closer to the sun where it's much greater density. I think perhaps one more question? Oh, what is the inspiration of Childhood's End? I wrote that more than 20 years ago. In fact, I began work on it a quarter of a century ago. This date I just can't remember. I don't really, and it's a lifetime's reading, and background. Oh, very much. Stapleton was the greatest single influence on my life. Stapleton and Wells. Thank you very much.
Mr. Clarke, we're very grateful to you for being with us to open our colloquium series. And as I said earlier, Mr. Clarke has a few minutes where he will meet people down front, but that we are working on a schedule where he'll need to be out in the foyer in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you.